So good morning. My name is John Davis and I'm Chief Executive of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association UK. And I'm delighted to have with me this morning the Leader of the House of Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, thank you very much for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure. I'm very glad to have been invited. Thank you.
As Leader of the House, you've been right at the centre of the House's response to COVID-19 and how it's coped as an institution. I wonder whether you could give us just some key moments from your perspective on how the House has reacted and to that challenge.
Yes. Well, when the crisis first hit and the lockdown was first introduced, the concern was that the House wouldn't be able to sit at all and that we would come back after the Easter recess and have to go away again, that there would be no facility for Parliament. And the House authorities were absolutely magnificent in getting together a hybrid Parliament. And it may surprise you to know that I was very keen that this should happen because, much though I prefer a real Parliament, I thought a hybrid Parliament was better than us not sitting, because the job of scrutiny and of passing legislation is one that needs to continue, not just even during a pandemic, but particularly when there's a crisis on. So that was a great achievement. And then when we got back, we were doing scrutiny, but we weren't doing legislation sufficiently. And those are sort of two sides of the same coin in a way. So we then pushed to get remote voting introduced, but we're still not getting the routine amount of business through. Without people being here, it was very difficult to get enough people on bill committees and so on. So then it was the move back to physical, partly showing our leadership for the country at large, that the country was beginning to get back to normal, and therefore we should be leading the way, but partly to ensure that Parliament could do its job fully. So there were essentially the three stages in the process, but ensuring that scrutiny continued all the way through.
And if you look back on that, it seems very condensed. Time is behaving strangely, it feels at the moment. If you look back on that, what would you say were the most challenging moments where it was hardest to bring everything together between the various parties, between the administration, between the technical side? Which were the most difficult things to actually make happen, would you say?
I think the technical achievement in getting a hybrid Parliament up and running was very considerable, that the Commons authorities worked all the way over Easter. And it's a small team in broadcasting and in digital who had to do that to ensure that enough members could be involved at any one time. So I think the initial maximum was 140 members could be plugged in at any one time. And that was sufficient to make Parliament work and make scrutiny work. But you had to do it in 2-hour slots, the technology had to be reset, and so on. So I think that element of work was crucial. And I can tell you that on the first day when we tried it, I think the Speaker and I were holding our breath all day, just in the hope that it didn't go down and stay down after the very first question came live.
Yes, I think I might have jinxed that, because I'd actually done one of these interviews with David Mundell, who I think was the first, slated to be the first person asking a Prime Minister's question. I've been speaking to him that morning, perfectly successfully from his constituency. Then I think he was actually one of the few victims of the line dropping out. But there we are. We didn't take it personally at CPA. But I suppose you took that as a key moment. Obviously, the first time various of these hybrid processes went live. I suppose on the return, there was a lot of public attention when you moved away from hybrid, and actually there was quite a challenging moment, I suppose, with those first divisions afterwards. But again, looking back on that, what lessons does Parliament take from that, do you think?
You're absolutely right that the queues for the first 2 divisions were quite long. That's now settled down. We've had a number of other divisions that way, and the queues have been reorganised and they're flowing much more smoothly. The waiting time has come down. I think the lesson is whenever you introduce a new system, it takes a bit of time to work. And the one thing you don't have is time, because you've got to get on with the business at hand. And I suppose you could have done a test of 500 people trying to vote by getting 500 actors to come in, but not when you're in the midst of a pandemic that is discouraging large gatherings. And so you only want people who have to work, and therefore you don't do the testing that you would have done in normal circumstances to arrange the queues more effectively. But I would also say that MPs sharing the experience of their constituents and recognizing that there is discomfort in the lockdown, that it does make life harder for people. And that was a very visible sign that we were, to an extent, sharing the pain of our constituents.
Yes, and it's been interesting talking to your colleagues from both houses, predominantly the Commons, and I suppose a range of views. Most of them expressed missing some of the cut and thrust, that sort of more interactive element, the face-to-face side of things. So I think that seemed to be very widely shared. Others, you won't be surprised to hear, it tended to depend on their personal circumstances, and also those particularly with further to travel. Actually, I think we're finding it the hybrid system a very effective system. I wonder whether it's whether there is thought being given to keeping some of the elements of this, particularly to allow those who, for whatever reason, it's challenging for them to be physically present in Westminster.
There are things you do in an emergency that you don't do in ordinary time, and we've kept an element of the hybrid system for those with shielding or carrying responsibilities. But in truth, Parliament has to come together in one place, and this is partly for high-minded constitutional reasons, that we aren't representatives of our little area standing up purely for our constituents. We come together as a national parliament, and that requires being in one place. It's partly the whole idea of the unity of the nation. So it's the anniversary of the murder of Jo Cox, and one of the things, messages from her was that there's more that unites us than divides us. But to be united, you need to come together. You can't show that if you're separated. But it's also a matter of ensuring that the work gets done, and the work wasn't getting done whilst we were remote. So legislative committees weren't taking place, and that was obviously a problem.
We obviously, as the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, or the UK part of it, one thing we've been doing a lot at is looking at how other parliaments are doing this, and how Parliament, and trying to help parliaments learn from each other indeed on this. And your role will be one that I think is familiar in some parliaments but not in others. But you have I think, almost unique role within our parliament of being both the leader of the House, but also a party figure, but also a government figure. I just wonder whether that's been particularly difficult in this period.
I don't think it has. I spent many years on the backbenches, and I have a great love for the institution of the House of Commons, and I'm a great defender of the rights of members of Parliament. So, and one of the things that's come up is, what if since 1340, members of Parliament have had a right to attend, and no government can possibly tell a member of Parliament not to come. It's a fundamental democratic point. You have the right to attend. And the other thing that I see, both as it happens as a constituency MP with my own team, but also get lots of representations about from MPs, is if particular ministries aren't responding in a timely manner to correspondence. And I'm very keen to take up, because something members of Parliament have been doing since 1265. It's fundamental. And so I rather enjoy the dual role, because I'm a great supporter of the government's policy. I want us to deliver on the manifesto commitments, but I want to do so in a way that meets the requirements of the Constitution.
Yes, and I suppose one parliament which we work with quite a lot is the New Zealand Parliament, and they have a stronger tradition, I think, of party whips, as it were, being responsible for the votes of their representatives in Parliament. I suppose the hybrid system, sorry, I beg your pardon, the proxy system at the moment potentially will go down quite well with the whips of the parties, because it gives them a bit more control over who's voting on what.
Well, I was very interested to see how many proxies have been given to the Deputy Whip on the Conservative side. I think he's now got over 40 votes, which is one of the drawbacks to a proxy system, in my view. I think the independent-mindedness of members of Parliament is an important way of ensuring proper scrutiny. That yes, Conservatives are elected on a Conservative manifesto, but that doesn't mean that they're not allowed their independent views and shouldn't sometimes express them. though I've never been a whip, so I'm probably more in favour of rights of individual MPs than others.
Yes, no, and it's interesting. It's always struck us when we've been talking to New Zealand and other parliaments who have that sort of even stronger party discipline, that the UK in that sense has always had a strong tradition of independent and the ability to, quote, rebel. I don't know whether actively you've had chance to look at what other parliaments have been doing in this crisis, or whether you and the team have been particularly struck by examples of what's happening in other places.
Yes, very much so. When we were discussing how we would do a hybrid system, we looked at what other parliaments were doing, what they were doing in terms of meeting and in terms of voting. You mentioned New Zealand. We were very struck by New Zealand setting up a select committee when it was in recess to try and hold the government to account. We didn't go down that route because we already had lots of select committees up and running. And interestingly, select committees were the first to operate in a hybrid sense and can continue to do so very well, particularly taking witnesses. And go back to an earlier question, that's one of the things that can easily remain in place to allow a greater fluidity of select committees. So the New Zealand experience was one we looked at, but we looked at any number of voting systems and approaches to dealing with a crisis of this kind.
Yes, it's been interesting. I think that's a widely shared view on committees. One of our executive committee yesterday was saying he thinks it's actually become a more effective way sometimes of questioning whether it be a government minister, whether it be an external witness. If I may, Leader of the House, you mentioned constituencies or constituency work at an earlier point. Obviously, along with everything else you're having to do, you're still the constituency MP for North East Somerset. And I wonder how you've been managing to combine that at this time with everything else you're trying to do.
Well, it's very different because normally as a constituency MP, you're busy going around the constituency, meeting people, seeing all the people with concerns, having weekly surgeries. And instead, almost everything is being done by correspondence or by conference call. And I'm very lucky. I've got a very good team who I think probably in the first month of the crisis worked harder than they've ever had to work before. That people concerned about employment, businesses, a whole range of issues came up from they needed to contact their member of parliament. So there's been a huge amount of work going on. But for me, it's been very different work because I haven't had physical surgeries and I obviously haven't been visiting businesses and schools and so on within the constituency.
Yes, and I think, again, a familiar tale from speaking to others. Perhaps one final question, if I may. We've taken a lot of your time, but obviously the House of Lords has almost been moving in almost opposite directions to the Commons in terms of the mix of hybrid and virtual. I just wondered how you, as Leader of the House of Commons, have been managing that, not least in terms of the legislative process, which you were talking about earlier.
Well, I'm jolly glad I'm Leader of the House of Commons rather than Leader of the House of Lords. I think that it is much easier getting legislation through the House of Commons than it is through the House of Lords. And the technology makes the House of Lords even slower than it normally is. And so that is an issue for the pace of our legislative programme, that the Commons with public bill committees now back up and running since we came back to a physical parliament is absolutely on track with the legislative programme. The Lords is not in that position.
Well, we will no doubt continue to watch that space, or watch those spaces. Leader of the House, thank you so much for giving us your time today, both within the UK and right across the Commonwealth. There's a lot of interest, as you know, in how Westminster behaves and acts and changes itself. So we really appreciate your time and sharing your thoughts with us today.
It's absolutely my pleasure, and thank you for all you do for the Commonwealth, because that's such an important part of our shared history, and there's so much that we in the UK can learn from other Commonwealth democracies. So thank you.
Thank you.